the story of Easter from the Gospel of Luke. But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again?" Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. On this Easter Sunday, O God, meet us where we are and open our hearts to you. Amen. Centuries ago, a monk was pondering the meaning of Holy Week, and he thought, what a surprise ending. And then suddenly, like a bolt of lightning, he had a new insight, and he started laughing, and he kept laughing. And he laughed so hard that he startled his fellow monks. I mean, this was a monastery, a place of piety. So they looked at their laughing brother with that look that says, "Have you lost your mind?" And the laughing monk looked at them and said, "Don't you see? Don't you see? It was a joke. Easter was a joke. The best joke in all of history. On Good Friday, when Jesus was crucified, the devil thought he had won. But on Easter, God raised Jesus from the dead. Satan had been fooled, and God had the last laugh on Easter." And so the monks called it the Easter laugh. And they began a monastic tradition that on Easter Monday, they would gather to tell jokes, to laugh, and to remember that the joke had been played on Satan, that God had had the last laugh. And so on this April Fool's Day, we remember God had the last laugh. Satan had been fooled, that Jesus, once dead, was now alive, resurrected. So happy April Fool's Day, Satan. And it was the women. It was the women. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, a woman named Joanna, and other women, says Luke, the gospel writer. It was those women that went to the tomb. This is what he says. On the first day of the week at early dawn, they, the women, came to the tomb taking spices they had prepared. Now, we remember that the women of the first century didn't get much press. But Luke says earlier in his gospel that it was a group of women who also accompanied Jesus and the disciples, and that they provided the financial support, which means that some of the women were people of means. But it also says something about how Jesus saw people, not their gender, and including them in his ministry. Now, I can imagine how low they were that morning, how depressed they were. I mean, in a time, in a culture, in a religion where the prayers of Jewish men thanked God that they were not born a woman. These women had been embraced by Jesus and included in his ministry, and they had responded as loyal followers. And while the men disciples slept, these women did what you and I often do to honor our dead loved ones. They did something. Anything to show respect, love, admiration. As in when we put a flower or a flag on a grave. Or how our Moravian neighbors wash the tombstones. Or we write tributes or memorialize the dead with placards, or honor them with a placard inside a hymnal cover. But for this group of women, their act of honor was bringing their perfume oils, because those were the oils that you used to preserve the body. They were preserving the dead and decaying body of their loved one, their friend, Jesus. It was a gruesome task, which would have been done on Friday, except that it was the oncoming of the Sabbath, and the laws would not allow them to preserve the body on Friday. So on Sunday, this is where they were going and why they were headed that way. And then the news that stunned Jerusalem. The stone covering the tomb had been rolled away. And so walking in the tomb, these women found no body. Instead, two angels stood beside them. The women were so terrified that they looked to the ground. And then they heard these two men, these two angels, say, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen." And the angels reminded the women of Jesus' words. And when they remembered that Jesus had foretold this, then they left the tomb, they returned to the disciples, and they told them what they had experienced and discovered. And the disciples' reaction? Luke says they did not believe the women. Rather, it seemed to them a preposterous idea, an April Fool's joke, right? Or as Luke says, an idle tale. I mean, we can just hear their response. I mean, who can believe these hysterical women and their exaggerated stories? But Peter, spontaneous, combustible Peter, got up and ran to the tomb to see for himself, and what he saw were linen cloths that were used to wrap the dead body of Jesus just lying there. And then he went home, stunned, amazed. Now, wouldn't it be something to discover that the first Easter actually fell on the Gregorian calendar's April 1st, April Fool's Day? I mean, God does have a sense of humor, right? Of course, there really are people in today's culture who think Easter really is an April Fool's joke, right? An idea so preposterous that they smirk at the idea of Easter, laugh at a faith that is built on an empty tomb and a once dead preacher being resurrected. And they think you and I are the fools who would base our life on the reality, on the existence of God, and that our God would be a God-man who was crucified, dead, and we base our faith on his resurrection? No, for some, Easter is a kid's fairy tale where the bunny brings eggs and candy for the children. So where are you on Easter? I mean, it's a great day. It's a wonderful day of music and alleluias. There's a spirit of joy and celebration in the air. It's a day when we dress festively, we eat scrumptiously, and we celebrate the arrival of spring. I mean, even if we're not quite sure about this religion thing, this is a day we want to be a part of, right? So where are you on Easter? Well, three old guys often had breakfast together at a local diner where they tried to impress each other with their knowledge that came from the school of hard knocks. And one of the waitresses asked them if they were ready for Easter. And one of the guys baited the other by saying, "I bet you guys don't even know what Easter is." And one guy said, "Of course. I mean, Easter's a holiday where there's a big feast and people give thanks and we eat turkey." And the second guy said, No. Easter is when we celebrate Jesus' birth and exchange gifts." No, said the third guy who'd asked the question. "Easter is a Christian holiday, and it coincides with the Jewish festival of the Passover. And Jesus was having the Passover feast with his disciples when he was betrayed by Judas. And the Romans arrested him, and they hung him on a cross. And eventually, he died. And they buried him in a tomb that was a cave." And the waitress said, "That is very impressive." And then the guy continued, "Now every year, the Jews roll away the stone and Jesus comes out. And if he sees his shadow, 6 more weeks of winter." So, where are you on Easter? If you're a skeptic and believe intellectually that you cannot find enough proof to substantiate the resurrection, then you probably never will. Because even if CNN had been there on Easter morning, and even if they had filmed the women walking up to the tomb and discovering it empty, then talking to what they believed were angels, what would it prove? That Jesus' body was missing? That the tomb was empty? And all those stories of people encountering a resurrected, living Jesus? I mean, how can you prove those stories are true and not some hallucination it's gotten on steroids somehow with groupthink? I mean, today in 2018, we are raised and educated in a culture that relies on the scientific method of data gathering, of proving and disproving theories with supporting evidence. How can you square the death and resurrection of Jesus within that criteria? Though I'm convinced that Jesus was authentic through and through, and that the story of Holy Week, of his crucifixion, death, and resurrection are true, I can't prove it. I can't prove it any more than I can prove that God is real or that God is love. No, not using the scientific method. You with me? I mean, even if we could prove the things surrounding Easter, even if we could prove that it was historical and factual, we could not use those facts to prove what Easter means. Because the meaning of Easter is about a resurrecting God. A God who defeats death with resurrection. A God who shows us that our lives will not end with death, but we will be resurrected into a life that we don't have words or imagination or the vocabulary to articulate. And just as important, maybe more important, is Easter's meaning that God is a resurrecting God who resurrects our lives into God's purposes. So when I ask, where are you on Easter, it's a lot more than asking you about the facts that are surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus. I am asking if you are ready to let this resurrecting God resurrect your life. Or if you are ready to let God use your life for the resurrecting purposes that God is all about. Such as taking those old values in us that are all about me and resurrecting a value, God's value, that we are our neighbors, our brother and sister's keeper, and resurrecting that in us. Or dying to things that cripple us emotionally and resurrecting in us a new spirit. Or about that resentment that is so deep in us. Letting God resurrect a spirit of forgiveness in us. I mean, when I say, where are you on Easter? I mean, that's a question of resurrection. Wherever you are on your spiritual journey, are you ready to take the next step of resurrection? Are you? Now, I wondered this week about the origin of April Fool's Day. Some historians say that April Fool's Day dates back to 1582 when France switched to the Gregorian calendar. But communication, being what it was in those days, meant people were slow in getting the news that the start of the new year had moved from April the 1st to January the 1st. And somehow the celebration of the new year on April the 1st evolved into a day of jokes and hoaxes and pranks. It became so popular that it spread across into Great Britain during the 18th century. And in Scotland, for instance, the tradition became hunting the gawk, in which people were sent on phony errands. The gawk was the word for cuckoo bird, which meant it was a symbol for a fool. And in modern times, people have gone to great lengths to create these elaborate April Fool's Day hoaxes. In 1957, the BBC reported that Swiss farmers were experiencing a record spaghetti crop and showed footage of people harvesting noodles from trees. And in 1985, Sports Illustrated tricked many of its readers with a made-up story about a rookie pitcher named Sid Finch, who, because he had studied Eastern philosophy, had learned how to throw a fastball over 150 miles per hour. And in 1996, Taco Bell duped people when it announced it had purchased our country's Liberty Bell and intended to rename it the Taco Liberty Bell. And in the Jerusalem Times, in 33 AD, the headline read, "Dead Jewish prophet comes alive." It had to have been April the 1st. God always has the last laugh.